Mic is on. So, good morning and welcome to the Explorers Club and our first annual Shackleton Global Day, and for the occasion to honor Sir Ernest Shackleton's birthday. My name is David Press, and I am a life member of the Explorers Club. I am honored to welcome everyone here today at the Explorers Club's headquarters in New York City. Today you will hear from our illustrious speakers to tell the story of Ernest Shackleton, the man and the story of Shackleton and his Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition, one of the most extraordinary stories ever told. The primary goal of Shackleton's expedition was to cross Antarctica on foot, first going to the South Pole and continuing on to the other side of the continent. At this point, I may ask, by a show of hands, what members of the Explorers Club are here today? Oh, that's quite a bit. Now, by a show of hands, who have journeyed to Antarctica? I guess that's what it takes to get into the Explorers Club. Would be wonderful for members of the Explorers Club and non-members also to greet each other and make further relationships going forward. Now, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition took about 25 months from departing London to being rescued. I'm going to give you a quick synopsis in 2 minutes, or what took 25 months. So on August 1st, 1914, Shackleton's crew got permission to launch. And when I say permission, about 2 or 3 days earlier, war was breaking out in Europe, and Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, put a halt on the ship being launched because there's 28 very able seamen. But 3 days later, a telegram came from Winston Churchill, and there was one word in the telegram, and the word was proceed. So keep that in mind for a little later. So it took about 2.5 months to launch from London to Buenos Aires, at which point Shackleton joined the group. They replenished the stores, and about 2.5 weeks later, they took off for South Georgia. When arriving in South Georgia at Grytviken, the whaling station, they stayed about 1 month. When they launched out of South Georgia, in only 2 days, they were getting caught in the pack ice. And in 6 weeks, they were completely stuck in the ice. They were stuck for 8 months when Shackleton decided it's time to get off the ship, take off the stores and the supplies, and find a way that we can survive. You don't have iPhones in those days. 1 month later, the ultimate happened. Endurance found its final resting place, 3,000 meters below the ice. So for 4.5 months, Shackleton's men, all 28 of them, lived on a ice floe, flowing north towards Elephant Island. And at that point, the ice floe was melting, and they decided to take the lifeboats and make it for Elephant Island, which they did. That took about a week. At that point, Shackleton decided to harden the James Caird lifeboat and harden it and work on the sails and make it ocean going, which they did. So in 17 days, they actually got to South Georgia Island, but not to the north part where the whaling station was. After many attempts, they could only land in the south part of South Georgia. With that, Vincent, McCarthy, and McNish got off the lifeboat, and Shackleton and Tom Crean and Frank Woolsey made a dash for the whaling station. They climbed a snowy, icy mountain. It took 36 hours to get there. They only slept about 10 minutes in those 36 hours. The crossing was extraordinary. They're on a 22-foot lifeboat. They are dealing with level 9 force winds up to 75 miles an hour. They traveled 800 miles with the roughest ocean in the world. I saw a lot of hands go up with Antarctica, and you all know what that's like. This was not a luxury ship. This was a 22-foot open boat. It's extraordinary. And they nearly capsized. And if they had capsized, that would be the end. So when Shackleton and the 5 others reached the southern coast of South Georgia, again, the 3 men were dropped off, and the Shackleton, Crean, and Woolsey hiked over the mountain range and finally got to the whaling station. This was an extraordinary, unbelievable task. The odds were pretty much zero that they could get that far. So Carolyn Alexander, the author of the book, The Endurance, put it this way. They could hardly have known or cared that in the carefully weighted judgment of the James Caird would be ranked as one of the greatest boat journeys ever accomplished. Now, she said, boat journey. This was an open boat. So the odds were really against it. Now, we're all attached to this story. It's an extraordinary story. It's one of the best. But there has to have some more meaning to what we enjoyed reading about, seeing about with the documentaries, and hearing about it. So the idea is to carry forward lessons of life. And so, number one, the Apollo 13 spaceship, 1/2 century later, had exactly the same kind of problem. The initial protocol failed, but the final success occurred unplanned. And so that was both with Endurance and with Apollo 13. Such an incredible coincidence. So now, how do we make this story relevant to everybody in the world, in their own lives, and their own humanity, and their own science? So there's one example I often talk about, and it's a little boy who lives in Mali, in French West Africa. And he's in the Bambara tribe. Everybody's poor, but they noticed that there was a little boy who was very, very smart. And so the tribal elders helped him along with getting a fine education. So he went to the Pierre and Marie Curie University in Paris, and he studied mathematics, physics, and analytical mechanics and got his bachelor's. He then went to Washington, D.C., to Howard University, where he got his master's in aerospace engineering and a PhD in mechanical engineering. Now, everybody in this room, a period in their lives, probably as kids, we all had a spark given to us by somebody else. And we call this the big spark. And this boy, Chayek, had an incredible experience that the recruiter from JPL in Pasadena, California, hired Chayek to join engineering and building space probes. So he started with the Magellan probe to Venus. Now remember, this is a little kid in Mali with no opportunities. He worked on the Ulysses probe to the Sun, the Galileo spacecraft to Jupiter, and his favorite program, the Mars Pathfinder of the Sojourner rover. Now, when the rover was landing, this was televised all over the world, and in particularly Africa, where Chayek is from. So everybody, as we did when Apollo 11 was landing on the moon, this was similar to Africans watching the rover land, seeing it or hearing it. And so all of Africa got their big spark. They were so proud of him. And at that point, Chayek asked for a leave of absence so he can go back to Africa and go around Africa and give everybody the big spark. And he did. And his program is is the Pathfinder Foundation, named after the rover. So now, I did a little research, and universities all around the world have published stories about Shackleton, the Endurance, the men, and how leadership and management and teamwork and strategic planning all plays, and these are usually read about through business school. And so this project of endurance has legs like you can't believe. And thank God for the ability to pass on the big spark to everybody else. Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to announce, I'm going to welcome our next speaker, Steve Scott Fawcett, good friend of ours, and I will give that to you in one moment. So, Stephen is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society in England, of course, London, and the honor editor of the James Caird Society Journal, which is based in Dulwich College in London, where Shackleton went to school. He also is the main administrator of the Sir Ernest H. Shackleton Appreciation Society, a private Facebook group with 11,500 members worldwide. Additionally, is an IAATO Antarctic Ambassador and Polar Guide of the Ross Sea region. Between 2011 and 14, Stephen was invited by the Scott Polar Research Institute at the University of Cambridge in the UK to undertake doctoral research on until the embargoed archives of the British Graham Land Expedition of 1934 through 1937. So with that, I introduce Stephen Scott Fawcett. And now I say proceed.
Well, I'm going to have to keep this brief because I'm aware that we're sitting in this beautiful room and we don't want to fall asleep too much with too much talking, do we? So you've had the introductions to who I am. I just want to take this brief opportunity to thank the Explorers Club for their extraordinary hospitality and efficiency in making this day happen. So Menson and I thought about it along with these lovely people here about a year ago-ish or thereabouts, having run a similar convention at the RGS in London in May last year. And Menson and I struggled. We're amateurs when it comes to arranging conventions. We had the invaluable help of Jamie Owen, who will be with us here today. He is with us today and speaking at the RGS. We had a very successful convention, and it was called the S150, hence S150. But of course, today is S151, but we'll forget that slight technicality. But I just want to say a great thank you indeed, as I say, to the Explorers Club for everything that they've done to make this day possible, and frankly, for flying me and our speakers over from wherever we live. That's very generous of them. So I'm not going to steal the thunder of Kevin's next lecture, which is coming up in a few moments' time. But I just want to just set the scene as I see it, as allegedly an expert in the life and times of Ernest Shackleton. We know, don't we, that Ernest was born on the 15th of February, yes, today, in 1874, just a bit before our time, I think. But he passed on the 5th of January, 1922, in the early throes of the Quest expedition, which we'll be hearing about today as well. He was just 41 days shy of his 48th birthday. As a matter of fact, when he died, his wonderful wife, Lady Emily, did what she could to create a faithful record of this man's reputation. For all the estrangement that went on in their lives as a married couple, and believe me, it was tough for Emily, she nevertheless did an extraordinary thing, and along with her her biographer, produced this first official biography of Shackleton to effectively state the claim that despite the rumours flying around in those days, the human politics were extraordinary, just as much as they are today. They were very prevalent in those days, and there was a lot of stuff about Shackleton and Scott and alleged tensions. And so effectively, Lady Emily wanted to correct the record. But you know, within about a couple of years of that attempt to correct the record, Shackleton's legacy faded. Maybe not so much in the States, because I'm rather speaking from the point of view of an Englishman perhaps, but certainly as far as I see it, Shackleton faded away from our memories. And we in Britain, typically being British Empire-ish, much favoured a dead hero than a live one, even though that's contrary to what, of course, Shackleton said to Emily when he came back from the Nimrod expedition, to say, well, I didn't get to the South Pole because I turned round because I assumed you wanted me to be a live donkey rather than a dead lion. We've probably heard that expression. But we in Britain love a dead hero. Well, we used to. I don't think we do now. So actually, I'm not joking here, because it's quite serious. Poor old Shackleton was sidelined. And then 60 years later, a book came out which basically put the cat among the pigeons, it has to be said. In 1985, a man, a very academic individual called Roland Huntford, produced a biography of Shackleton, having already researched the lives of Amundsen and Scott and written about those two together, talking about the alleged race between the two. I have to tell you, it was never a race, but never mind. When I read this book in 1985, I was a novice in this whole business of Shackleton, in this whole business of polar history. I knew nothing. When I'd finished reading the Shackleton book, I wept. I seriously wept, never done this before in my life. When I've read a book, especially a biography or even an autobiography, I've never been emotionally charged by much. Interested, yes. I wept, and I didn't want the book to end. I later discovered, by the way, that some of the things that Roland Huntford said were either inaccurate factually or wholly unjustified in terms of the kind of disparaging of Scott. And I stand before you today an absolute Shackleton fan, but no less an admirer of Captain Scott. I'll say that now. This extraordinary book that basically rubbished Scott, that's what Shackleton's the biography did, has created a backlash. I'm not sure it's happened in the States. I'll keep this brief because I know time's running off. But there was a backlash, and there has been a backlash in the UK, and I think possibly in the States. That is to say, a backlash against Huntford's assertion that Captain Scott was a bit of an idiot and that Shackleton was the man. Well, I kind of agree with the last bit, but I don't agree with the first bit. So what we find today, interestingly, is a kind of rebalancing of those two legacies, certainly from the perspective of we British. I know that you Americans have your own polar history. We won't go into that today. I studied the British Graham Land expedition for doctoral purposes, but you guys called it Palmerland. Never mind. We'll move on. Today, you're going to listen to some outstanding speakers, and I hope today you'll find it'll be an outstanding event and an experience. I genuinely hope that's the case. I'm very pleased and thankful to but the speakers that have come, because all of them, bar John, lovely John from Canada, were at the event in London speaking, that is. And I'm very grateful that they've come to be with us in New York today. I'm very grateful to John for coming too. But I think that was because mentioned twisted your arm. Is that right, John? I don't know. But what we're having today through these speakers in a variety of ways is about a man. And I call Shackleton, I just want to finish by saying this bit, I call Shackleton a marvelous maverick. Why do I call it, and this is not Top Gun Maverick, by the way, this is the disparaging word, maverick. Why do I call Shackleton, and I do call him a marvelous maverick? Well, it's because, perhaps inevitably, because if we all look at our own individual lives, we're a bit of a mix of good, bad, and indifferent, aren't we? Let's face it, there's a bit of black, there's a bit of white in all our lives, I think. But certainly there was in Shackleton's time, in Shackleton's life. Because at once, this man Shackleton was a brave, durable, an amazing leader, a charismatic man, a poet, no less, and, would you believe, a philanthropist. And at the same time, in the same body, so to speak, we have a man who was a totally and utterly inept businessman, a bit of a womanizer, a terribly unreliable husband, actually, not just on the womanizing front, but also in terms of being a family man. I mean, how can you be a particularly good family man, even if you think you love your family? Well, you do love your family, but then you don't spend more than 4 days a year with them on average. I mean, you know, just think about that. There'd be lots of divorces if we went off, wouldn't we, and did it with our own wives in the modern time. But actually, interestingly, Shackleton was a bit of an insecure man. Privately, you read the correspondence that pinged around between him and his wife, Emily. Very wise woman. I'd like to come back and talk about Emily at another convention one day. You know, the woman behind the man, an extraordinary person. No Emily, no Shackleton. I'm just going to say that, leave it, let it fester. Right. But he was very insecure, and it was Emily, and really only Emily, that kept him going. Believe me, it's true. And he had a dicky heart. I find it ironic that whenever he started to interview men, apart from the curious things of he liked someone's face, or that person made him laugh. These were the kind of measurements, so to speak, metaphorically, that Shackleton used to gauge whether he wanted to recruit men for his expeditions. But they had to be physically fit. Yet the man who led them was certainly not physically fit, because it caught up with him, as we know, finally on his quest expedition. To me, Shackleton was, and still is, if you like, a walking contradiction. But for me, he was a real human being, not a false, here it comes, false fabricated celebrity so prevalent in today's culture. Shackleton was the genuine article when it comes to heroism. I'm going to finish off by saying that I've recently read a book that's a bit off-centre. It's a book written by a lovely French lady author, Dominique Brecan. She published a book where, in fact, she wanted to express publicly of her passionate romantic love for Shackleton. Not just an admiration. She's a very attractive lady, and she's very much in love with Shackleton. Lucky man. But he's dead. And I said to her when she came to the London conference last year, well, what about his womanizing? That makes him more of a man. Can someone, in the spare time we have today, can a lady come up to me privately and explain how that one works? So as I say, her book might be a little bit off center, but the one thing that her book absolutely makes clear is that we're celebrating a man who is a real human person that shaped not just the lives of the people of his time. Clearly he did. Speak to any of his crew, apart from Eric Marshall, probably, maybe McNish, maybe John Vincent. But anyway, the vast majority of them loved the man. He shaped the lives of the people of his time. He also shapes the lives of the people today. Just look at us, shaped by a legacy of a man 150 years after he was born plus. Thank you very much for that. I'll move on. We're now going to get stuck into our speakers, metaphorically that is. I'm going to introduce Kevin, who's flown in from Dublin. Thank you very much, Kevin. And he's going to start. I'm just going to ask Kevin, if you haven't thought about it already, that before you start speaking, just introduce who you really are and what you feel your role is in life and the story of Shackleton.
Great.
We'll all take notes, Kevin. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you for your applause. I prefer if people keep the applause till afterwards. Let's see how it goes down. So I have a job to do in about 20-25 minutes to bring you through Ernest Shackleton's life. Lots of people know pieces of it, so hopefully if you know pieces of it, they'll fit together in the jigsaw when I'm finished. If you're an expert in Shackleton, hopefully you'll pick up one or two new points. Just again, a quick thank you to Stephen, to the people in the Explorers Club who organised this, to various people who have really brought this event together. Enda, who I know you'll be hearing from later. So thank you anyway, and thank you all for coming along. I'm a statistician by trade, so you'll see odd figures popping up. They have no statistical significance. It just makes it interesting. Hopefully no one will fall asleep. This is going to be an energetic run through just about 48 years of a life that really covered so much. And I hope as well, David in his introduction and Steve, Dave described the endurance expedition and so on, so I won't go into too much detail on that. But hopefully at the end you'll understand that last line of the summary of Ernest Shackleton versus Captain Scott and Royal Munsden, hopefully you'll see, endurance wasn't a once-off great decision. There were lots of great decision and great leadership moments and in this amazing person. For myself then, so I'm from County Kildare in Ireland, where Ernest Shackleton was born. As a teenager, I bought a second-hand Treasure Island. No particular significance, wanted to read Treasure Island. But out of it fell this postcard, which was from Ernest Shackleton to Jacobs, who are biscuit makers. And it just got me at that moment in my life. So again, our earlier speakers spoke about the spark and influencing and so on, and that really generated a big interest in Ernest Shackleton, and that's why I'm here. I often think if I bought the next book, I'd probably be locked up somewhere at this stage. So that's life, isn't it? Okay. So just Ernest Shackleton launched himself as a leader of expeditions in February 1907, when he appeared in the Royal Geographic Society. We'll be hearing from Jamie later. Amundsen was there to talk about his Northwest Passage. And again, it was Northwest Passage plus North Magnetic Pole. And when Amundsen's presentation was finished, Ernest Shackleton stood up and announced he intended to go to Antarctica that year, in about 6 months' time. He intended to go to Antarctica to try and reach the geographic South Pole and the magnetic South Pole. And, I'm talking about the two poles here because at the time, the geographic pole really, it would grab headlines, but it wasn't particularly of scientific interest. The magnetism and the North Magnetic Pole had been described after Newton had explained gravity. Understanding the Earth's magnetism and the magnetic poles was the next big sort of geoscience challenge. Okay, but I mean, what an announcement to make! He really wasn't known. He had been to Antarctica a few years previously on Captain Scott's first expedition, which he had participated in. But here he was coming up, largely unknown, tolerated by the Royal Society and the Royal Geographic Society, but not really supported. He was a merchant seaman, and he was going to organize ship, crew, supplies, everything in the next 6 months to get this expedition underway. And I mean, you talk about he intended to do it, he did it. So in June 1907, an old Newfoundland sealing ship called Nimrod appeared in London. It had to be really refitted, reorganized, but that was ready to go by the start of August, with crew, with supplies. So a huge undertaking. Interestingly, people weren't willing to sponsor or give him money. Most of the money came in loans or collateral. You know, the ship was collateral for one particular loan that he got. But the Nimrod expedition, 1907, 1909, and I'll call it Nimrod, name of the ship, it's easiest to remember, I think, had a lot of firsts in it. And remember, Antarctica, very little known about it, and the interior of Antarctica, distance from shore to pole, about 700-800 miles. No living off the land. Once you got inland, you had to have everything in terms of shelter, food, everything else. And, just extreme conditions. So, he had the hut erected to overwinter. As I said, Nimrod, the ship, brought first motor car in Antarctica, because he had the vision that motor transport would be the way. And brought ponies as well to haul the sledges. Again, the previous experience with Captain Scott, and up till then, really, haulage was man-hauling. And as someone described man-hauling, it's the best way to have a bad time in Antarctica. So he brought ponies to do that. And they worked out as a food source, as a haulage method, and as a food source. Just an interesting little aside, and sorry, it's slightly blurred, but this is a McKinley whiskey bottle, 10-year-old whiskey, which he brought with him, and which was the foundation of the rebranding, the Shackleton whiskey, which I see in the bar downstairs. But you'll be interested to see the label on that bottle. So this is 1907, but the label on the bottle, the neck label, has endurance. Can you see that? So, up here. So there was some anticipation or some idea on his part to call the ship Endurance. So this is particularly for Menson. I just want to reassure him he found the right ship. If there was a whiskey bottle floating around with Endurance on it down there, he had found Nimrod. But 9th January 1909, Ernest Shackleton and 3 others. Sorry. Yes. Let me go back a little bit here. Sorry, this my fault. Ernest Shackleton and 3 others are 97 geographic miles from the South Pole. They got to within 100 miles. Again, as Steve described, turned back, described it later as rather be a live donkey than a dead lion. A week later, another party reached the South Magnetic Pole. And this is just, you can see there was a lot of, Captain Scott had sort of banned him from using the area that Discovery had used. So there was a lot of messing around. He intended starting from this point here, but he ended up having to come back and set up his winter quarters, his hut, close to where the Discovery expedition had been.
Main results of the British Antarctic expedition of 1907 under my command are as follows. We reached a point within 97 geographical miles of the South Pole. The only thing that stopped us from reaching the actual point was the lack of 50 pounds of food.
Okay, so I'm not going to play the whole recording, but that's Ernest Shackleton describing it. 50 pounds of food he might have got there. Again, to give you an idea of the person, on the way back to their winter quarters, their shore quarters, the hut, the same day described in 2 different diaries. The top one you can see Ernest Shackleton, and I'll just read it very briefly. Frank Wilde was bad with dysentery. They picked up a marker mound at 4 p.m. And camped at 6 p.m. Very bad surface, did 13 miles. The same day, Frank Wilde describes. And the underlining is accurate, and there's double underlining in places. Shackleton privately forced upon me as one breakfast biscuit and would have given me another tonight had I allowed him. I do not suppose that anyone else in the world can thoroughly realise how much generosity and sympathy was shown by this. I do, and by God, I shall never forget it. Thousands of pounds would not have bought that one biscuit. Gives you an idea of the person. Okay, very briefly, could he have got to the South Pole? So they reached the South Magnetic Pole. This is Amundsen's map from his expedition, which reached the South Pole. Amundsen started from here, where Shackleton had originally intended starting from. You're all geographers and explorers. You realise the degree of latitude is 60 miles, 60 geographic miles. You can see he started from a degree and a bit further south. So just in theory, as the crow flies, as we say, yes, he would have been very close. And Amundsen did say that. Amundsen said, after he had reached the South Pole, Amundsen described if Shackleton had waited around for the conditions here, he might have found them better. And I think Amundsen said the whole issue of the South Pole would have been dispatched years previously. So imagine that. First expedition, they get the South Magnetic Pole and they almost get the South Geographic Pole, but they show that the South Geographic Pole is attainable. Back now to, so I started with the exciting bit, right? We were straight into an expedition. No one's fallen asleep, right? Okay. So now back to Ernest Shackleton, 1874, 15th of February, today, 151 years ago. There's his announcement of his birth in the Irish Times, born in Kilkee House. His parents, Henry and Henrietta. Henry, fifth generation Shackletons in Ireland. The Shackletons had come in the early 1700s as educators. They founded a school which dealt with all religions. Which in that time in Ireland still would be a bit of an issue. So Ireland's first cardinal went to that, plus a character who we'll hear a little bit about later called Napper Tandy, James Napper Tandy, who was a United Irishman and revolutionary. The family grew to 8 girls, 2 boys. There's Ernest in the middle, Frank, who was the chief suspect when the Irish crown jewels disappeared from Dublin Castle in 1907. No evidence. He was innocent. You know, two or three of his sisters achieved things as well in life, and particularly for women in those days. One of his sisters pioneered pediatric nursing in some of the Canadian states. Another was an artist of some renown. But the family, Ernest's father, with a growing family and so on in Ireland, thought being a farmer was precarious, so he went back, trained to be a doctor, moved to England, to London, and Ernest went to school there. Here he is at school. You always wonder who's the guy with his head stuck out the top window. Age 16, he appealed to his parents. He wanted to go to sea. There was no history of it, but his parents facilitated that, and that began his merchant marine career. On one of the voyages home, and I suppose with 8 sisters, it's stacked in your favour. You'll meet some of their friends, and he met Emily Dorman, who again Steve spoke about, who they shared a love of Browning, the poet, and you know both got on really well together. But he was a merchant seaman away for 9-10 months, so it was letters and so on between them. The captain on Shackleton's first voyage on the Houghton Tower, he said, "Shackleton is the most pig-headed, obstinate boy I've ever come across, but I would take him on any voyage." He was getting, you know, he wanted to impress Emily. He never felt worthy of Emily. He wanted to impress her. He was getting bored with the mercantile marine. So when the Discovery expedition was announced, 1900, 1901, he got on it as one of the two merchant seamen. It was staffed by scientists and naval personnel, but Ernest Shackleton managed to get on as a merchant seaman. There's Captain Scott, there's Frank Wilde, and there's Tom Crean. And again, on that first real foray, you know, of British exploration into Antarctica, there had been 1 or 2 previously, but again, Scott set out for the South Pole, got to 82 degrees 17, about 460 miles from the South Pole. But again, Scott, Shackleton, and Dr. Wilson, Shackleton got himself on that 3-person expedition. So you're starting to get an idea of a person who can set his mind to something and get there. But Captain Scott, Shackleton suffered very badly from scurvy on the way back when they turned around. So 1903, when a relief ship came down from New Zealand, Shackleton was dispatched home. But again, the sort of character he was. So he'd gone down to impress Emily. He's coming home as a sort of an invalid. That doesn't matter. He turned it into a success. He spoke about the exploits and got involved in refitting ships to go down to retrieve Captain Scott and so on. So, he never looked backwards. And sort of just some family life. He married Emily in 1904. You can see what she says about him there. He really never railed against anything. He never made a moan of anything. And just some family photos, because he was a family person. He was working in Scotland at the time. This is the Fort Bridge behind him. And this is an interesting photograph, 3 generations of Shackleton. Henry Shackleton, Raymond, their first son, and Ernest. So now we're going to link back to Nimrod. So we've had his early life. We've had Nimrod. That expedition almost reached the South Pole. So now we're connecting back. He arrived back to Charing Cross, ticker tape reception, thousands turned out. He had shown that it was possible to get to the South Pole overland. And had also shown his leadership. He had proved himself. We roll on then through the following years. 1911, Amundsen reaches the South Pole. 6 weeks later, Captain Scott. April, Titanic sinks. They're looking for an expert in ships and ice, and Ernest Shackleton turns up as the sort of expert witness in the Board of Inquiry. You can get the events online of that Board of Inquiry, but Shackleton really is there. He's representing the sailor. He knows how a ship works. He's saying things like, if you try and find an ice-free route to North America, the big companies won't put any lookouts, and you can't guarantee it. So he knew how all these systems worked, but really stood up for, if you stick a person up in the crow's nest as a lookout for 8 hours, they're going to get bored. So you can't do that. So, he had a really good idea of how people worked and how teamwork. Just a quick bit about Amundsen. When he reached the South Pole, this particular point, I hope you can reach it, but basically he says, this is the greatest moment in my life. I'm really overcome by this moment. And what was that moment? That moment was when he reached Shackleton's latitude. They stopped, they raised the Norwegian flag, took photographs and so on. And then he gives this tribute to Shackleton, that, Shackleton's name will be forever written in letters of fire on the Antarctic. Okay? So huge respect between the two of these great explorers. And I think just, finally when he reached the South Pole, he sort of said, no big deal. Okay? Right, just give you a moment there and I'll move on. Yes, so in my research, I did find somewhere where Shackleton reached a higher degree than Amundsen, and that's in Shackleton whiskey, which is 40% proof, and Amundsen's Aquavit comes in at 38. Okay, so we'll give him that. So that's 2 whiskey bottles in a presentation. You might remember the earlier one on Nimrod. I think that's fairly good going. Next big event, and I think, again, David and Steve have described it, so I'm not going to go into that too much, was the Endurance expedition to cross Antarctica from coast to coast. The Endurance coming in here, the Aurora coming in here, depots being laid up to the South Pole from this side, and a crossing from the Weddell Sea over to the South Pole. And then pick up the depots down to the Ross Sea. And just look, we've been through it. A quick summary of, this huge event, leaving at the outbreak of the war, ship being crushed, camping on the ice, the James Caird boat journey, reaching South Georgia, and then that final rescue, of the 22 that were living on this frozen rock on the 30th of August, 1916. But again, let's look at the person. This is Percy Blackborough, the stowaway on Endurance. Imagine a stowaway on Buenos Aires. You're looking for a ship back, and you get yourself on Endurance. And he appeared about 3 days out. Again, Shackleton was keen, very happy to sign him on, but keen to find out who had brought him on. He thought he knew his crew. He thought he knew how they worked. So, found out how that happened. And, Percy Blackborough's tribute to Shackleton is really, he was a generous leader. He was optimistic all the time. And really, he was second to none in terms of leading people. And he took a particular interest in the young 18-year-old Percy Blackborough, insisted he use the ship's library, carried him above the high water mark when they landed on Elephant Island so that he could be the first person to set foot on Elephant Island. And again, we have that amazing James Caird boat journey. Sorry, let me go back for a second. Yeah, and the piece I'd like to point out is 3 of the crew were Irish, okay? Tom Crean, Tim McCarthy, and Ernest Shackleton. Yeah, so that amazing event. Again, won't go into that, that's been covered. You've probably seen, you know, the film and the photographs. We're obviously looking at the photographs. And remember, a lot of those photographs were glass plate photographs. They were keeping them and preserving them. Sailors are saying, what are we doing with this? Like, we're living on floating ice. We have to be able to jump into the lifeboats. Why are we bringing these heavy, delicate things around? Shackleton's line was always, when we get back, no one's going to believe us. This is our evidence, okay? You know, this is film, again, of those last moments of endurance. You may have seen it. I'm not going to play it through, but it is available. Oh, sorry. Oh, what's happening? Yeah. Hopefully you'll recognise the wearing of the green. And that's about James Napper Tandy, the revolutionary who was educated at the Shackleton School in Ballytour. And that was sung on the James Caird. It was also the last record played on endurance in the wardroom before they abandoned the ship. Okay? So again, if you listen to it, you'll hear James Napper Tandy mentioned. I just want to, you know, so you've done all this, you've done the endurance, you're writing the book about it, you're asked to describe, you know, exactly, how do you summarize what happened? Sorry, I'm just going to have to move over to read it because I don't speak enough here. And basically, you paraphrase Robert Service. You say, we had pierced the veneer of outside things. We had suffered, starved, and triumphed, grovelled down, yet grasped at glory, grown bigger in the bigness of the whole. We had seen God in his splendours, heard the text that nature renders. We have reached the naked soul of man. That's how you summarize it. There was the whole piece of the extra person, the fourth person. It became sort of, it was picked up by T.S. Eliot when writing The Wasteland. And here he describes 2 people walking up the white road, the icy road together, but actually when he counts, there's 3. So there's that extra person that inspired him. I'm very near the end. I'm just running out of time as well, so don't get too worried. So basically, he then, you know, he's back. No one's interested in the success of his rescue and so on. It's the glorious defeat, World War I, the recovery from that. No one's that interested in it. So he decides to set off on another expedition. Initially, he's planning to go up north, but that all changes. He decides to go south, sort of circumnavigate Antarctica. He gets the ship to Quest, which you'll be hearing about later. But just here again, he's so famous. This young guy writes to King George and says, you know, will you please try and persuade Sir Ernest Shackleton, the explorer, to take me to the South Pole with him? My parents are agreeable. If I don't go, my life will be wrecked. Oh, please do your best. If you succeed, please send word quickly. I will live in the coal place, the coal bunker, if I can only go. I am not joking when I say that. Yours truly, Victor Hamling. Okay? Quest sets out. There's problems with the ship and so on. It has to spend time in Rio de Janeiro. Shackleton is under pressure to get to Antarctica before the season closes in. Just to say to you, I said I'm a statistician. 9 was, oops, sorry again. 9 was his lucky number. He had a silver 9 on his cabin door. But this letter here, I think, says it all. Exactly a month before he dies, he's in Rio de Janeiro, as I say, under pressure. And this little girl comes down to visit the ship, comes down with her father. They take a photo of Shackleton and the ship's dog, who is called Query. But before he leaves a letter with the harbour master in Rio de Janeiro to give to this little girl if she comes down again. And it says, "Little girl with many names, thank you for your letter and the photo and for your wishes for us. I like the picture of Query, our dog, and my fat hand and trousers. We are thinking of stealing you to make a laughing, happy mascot for the quest. That is not only my idea, but of all the officers who met you. There is much to do, so this letter ends with love from Ernest Shackleton, the boss, or shacks, or icebergs, or old cautious, whichever you like, I answer to them all. So he took the time to write that, and again, to try and give you an idea of the sort of person he was. And then, as you know, ship goes to South Georgia. South Georgia is so connected with the Endurance expedition and was a key part of that whole rescue. In the early hours of the 5th of January 1922, he has a heart attack and died. And again, the body is sent to Uruguay. Lady Shackleton says, no, he should be buried in somewhere close to Antarctica. That's really where his heart should lie. So he's brought back to South Georgia, buried there. And in a little touch, those who buried him, some of them his old crew, rather than face him east, which would be the Christian burial, they face him north-south, so his heart can be that slight bit closer to the South Pole that he never reached. And that's the end of my presentation, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much indeed. This man standing here waiting for questions and answers, they're cancelled.
Right. You can get me later, yeah.
We just want to try and keep this reasonably tight today, so there is a bit of a timetable here. But thank you so much, Kevin, and please attack him at any time you like during the intervals and lunch breaks. Any of our speakers will be very happy to answer any of your questions as long as you get paid nicely. I'm trying to be funny here, but English humour is very different to American humour. No, I jest. So now we're going to move on to our next speaker before we have a tea break. We're having a tea break at 10:30, Jamie, and then we're going to get all fitted up. Thank you. Mr. Musk is then going to connect us apparently with Mensum, who's bobbing around in a paddling pool somewhere. Jamie, please come forward, sir. Jamie very kindly helped me and Mensum out of a big hole in London, metaphorically that is, in really doing a lot that he could to help us set up the Shackleton 150 conference that we had, as I say, last year, and it's also really while we're here. So thank you once again, Jamie, for all that you did. Jamie's official title, amongst other things at the RGS in London, is photographic curator, but he does a lot more than that. So over to you, Jamie.
Is there a slide clicker? Is this it? Yay, there we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. So I'd just like to start by thanking the President, Director and officers and staff of the Explorers Club. It's an honour to be here today. I didn't actually think I was going to get here. I did a bit of climbing in Iran in 2017, and it was a bit more circuitous getting here, but the club helped me obtain a visa, so thank you. As Steve says, my name is Jamie Owen. I'm the licensing and commercial partnerships manager for the Royal Geographical Society. But we have a number of roles at the Society. We're a very small organisation, and the second of my roles is the curator of photography for the Royal Geographical Society. It's a role that I've performed for 18 years, and it's the role that I'm here in today. During the planning phase for today's conference, Mensum set me the title of Ernest Shackleton at the Royal Geographical Society, and I wasn't sure how to approach today, so I've not changed it. The reason I've not changed it actually is because of two conversations I had. The first conversation I had was with Lady Alexandra Shackleton, a lady who needs no introduction. The description's in the title, obviously, who said to me, well, you don't have very much stuff, Shackleton stuff, at the Royal Geographical Society, which struck me rather surprisingly, given she's very connected to the Society. And the second discussion I had was with Eugene Ray, our principal librarian, one of my closest work colleagues, who said, Shackleton, well, he's no Scot, is he? And secondly, he said, to back that up in true form, that Shackleton, he was a bit of a chancer, wasn't he? I didn't change the title because I wanted to tackle both of those slurs straight on, because they luckily offend both of my job titles. So today I'm just going to approach the presentation to tackle, first of all, obviously the depth of our collection and what they can tell us about Ernest Shackleton, and also the life and legacy of the man at the Royal Geographical Society. Before I start, though, Dave did a lovely hands up. Can I ask, are there any RGS fellows or members in the audience today? Not as many as the Explorers Club members and fellows, but that'll do. And has anyone here been to the RGS before? Oh. That counts. Oh, really? Oh, fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to actually. How do you go back? Perfect. So I just want to start with a bit of background to the society, to place it in time in relation to Shackleton. So, as some of you will know, your members and fellows, some of you have been there, the society began as a debating club in 1826. It was then known as the Raleigh Club, shortly after the end of the Napoleonic War, about 10 years or so before that. And it met in Thatched House Tavern in St James's. It became the the Geographical Society of London in 1830 and was given its royal charter by Queen Victoria in 1859. And from its inception, it's carried out, promoted or been the reporting body for countless acts of exploration and geographical science over that time. It was also responsible for the first seats in geography at Cambridge and Oxford, and is active all the way through to present in all levels of education, from early years through to professional geographers and further higher academic research. The central purpose of the society, it remains the same as it was almost 200 years ago when it was set out, the advancement of geographical science. And over that period of time, it's collected examples of geographical materials in all their forms. So maps, photography, books, first-hand written accounts, artifacts related to the geographical discipline, or tools and instruments used by explorers and scientists. These form our collections today, and this is what I'm going to be referring to in my talk. The depth of this collection is substantial. So we hold over 2 million items, the world's largest private map collection, over 3,000 artifacts, nearly 1 million pieces of original photography dating back to the inception of the photographic media, a significant art collection, thousands of original manuscripts and expedition reports, as well as an archive of cinefilm. The wonderful strength about our collection is that each element, the wonderful thing about our collection is that each element of the collections interrelates to the others to tell a wonderfully rich story. So handwritten expedition reports relate to the photographs that were taken, for example. So the photographs embellish the narrative that's been created by the traveller itself. The map collection underwrites all of this, delineating the routes on which travellers and explorers, scientists travelled, and you can pinpoint where photographs have been taken and where narrative and parts of expedition reports were written. So you get a wonderfully rich and deep story from some of these expeditions. So you might think that Ernest would get a little lost in this vast repository. Perhaps the vast size of the collection makes our holdings related to Shackleton seem small, so Zaz thinks. However, if you search for Shackleton in our catalogue, you'll find over 1,000 genuine records relating to the man. And as I mentioned, because of the nature of the interrelation between items, this means that you can begin to build up a portrait of Ernest Shackleton, perhaps one, as has been referred to, that's built up against the changeable nature of the politics of the Royal Geographical Society and the nature of that moment in history. So we're going to, sorry, this is a photograph that I just failed to move on to. This is part of the photographic collection. So this is all flat photographs. So all of our prints are mounted and then conserved in these boxes throughout. So this is probably about half of that almost million-strong collection of photography that we have. But what we're going to do today is we're going to work through the collection, beginning with our manuscript collection, in which you'll find journals, diaries, correspondence to and from the Society, fellowship certificates, as well as expedition reports. Here we have a lovely illustration from the South Polar Times of Shackleton as the passenger. He was well known for reading his Bible on the Discovery and was nicknamed accordingly. But here we have an example of a journal just on this side. This is the Antarctic Journal of Clements Markham. Sir Clements Robert Markham, KCB, FRGS, FCB, FRSGS, was an English geographer, explorer and writer. He was Secretary of the Royal Geographical Society, and he later went on to be the President of the Society for a further 12 years. In this capacity, he organised, or was one of the main organisers of the British National Antarctic Expedition, and he's also responsible for launching the polar career of Robert Falcon Scott. This comes from his polar journal. So Markham kept an Antarctic journal of his. It's a record of those men who travelled to the Antarctic and his thoughts on them. In this, he writes of Ernest Shackleton. Shackleton E, brackets, the perfidious protégé, son of a doctor at Norwood, but Irish, applied to Captain Scott to take him on the Discovery. He had no scientific qualifications, but was taken out of kindness, and partly owing to his importunity, taken in Scott's southern journey, but broke down and endangered the lives of others. Sent home invalided, started an expedition of his own. He goes on to say, knowing that Captain Scott was intending to complete his work, Shackleton gave a promise in writing that he would not touch Victoria Land, but went straight there, made a dash to cut out his old chief, and failed. Returning, he proved himself to be a colossal self-advertiser and swollen head and an ungrateful cad. He finishes by saying, the less said of his subsequent conduct, the better. Clements Markham is nothing but an interesting character. Just to put it in context, he writes of Roald Amundsen. He announced that he would make a dash for the South Pole to make money from the exploit. Fram landed him on the barrier in the Bay of Wales with 8 men and 116 dogs, Feb 1911, a very dirty trick, known as the Antarctic gadfly. William Bruce, he said, raised funds in Scotland and brought the old Norwegian whaler Hecla sailing in Jan 1902. In the first season, he did nothing interesting, an insolent charlatan. Of Carsten Borchgrevink, he said, this impudent imposter, now loafing in Australia, went as an ordinary seaman in the Antarctica in 1895. He landed at Robertson Bay with 60 dogs and did absolutely nothing for a year. A stupid, self-seeking, malignant liar. Clearly a man of great perception. But coming back to the point made in the previous lecture, we have a phenomenally deep collection, or archive collection, which describes the history of the Society and its interactions in great detail and at great length. It's a really great source for information, particularly when you're building up a picture of people. This is a very interesting letter from our Ernest Shackleton correspondence, dated 1900-1909, between Shackleton and the Society in the form of its secretary, Kelty. Shackleton says, "My dear Kelty, I wired you this morning that I had advised Scott that I would give up the McMurdo Sound base for his expedition. I thought very carefully over the matter, and as you can imagine, that by doing so I much diminish any chance of success in the way of a long journey. I feel that as he has decided to organise an expedition, and in view of his remarks as to the priority of claim, I ought to relinquish this plan of mine." So that's what Markham was referring to in his previous journal piece. So there's the beginnings of an interesting relationship between Scott and Shackleton. not wholly positive, as you can tell. But I want to take that relationship between Shackleton and the RGS a step on to the Endurance expedition. The following is a fascinating piece of archival content in the collection, which lends a lot of colour to the relationship between Shackleton and the Society and the wider relationship with the exploration community or the geographical community in England at the time. Again, correspondence from the Shackleton archive. This is an example of Society minutes held in the correspondence blocks. These are the unedited minutes. These are before it's been typed up. This is from a grueling inquisition of Ernest Shackleton and his plan for the Endurance expedition. It's chaired by the Society's president and top brass. And the minutes stretch to 34 pages. It must have been an incredibly long session. The inquisition is based on the fact that the RGS was going to give a phenomenal sum of £500 to the expedition, so they clearly wanted every possible piece of information for their money. Interestingly, it reads, the President, the idea is to put to Sir Ernest Shackleton the question that are in many people's minds as to the particular parts of his programme, and enable him to satisfy us that he has thought out these difficulties. From quite a number of quarters, I have had prepared for me the kind of views entertained on his expedition by experts. And as we are to a certain extent taking up Shackleton, it seems to me we are the body who ought to satisfy ourselves that his expedition is properly and scientifically thought out, and he has confronted all these possible dangers and difficulties. As I say, the meeting goes on to some length, quizzing Shackleton about every conceivable detail from the use of radio, etc. But touchingly, it ends with on a rather vulnerable note from Ernest Shackleton. Shackleton says, "May I say that I appreciate very much your asking me to this meeting in this kindly spirit, and I was only too glad to come, because I like to be taken seriously. I am perfectly aware that a lot of people do not take me very seriously. We do the work anyhow." I think a rather revealing little anecdote about the man. We know that he did confront all the dangers that the Antarctic had to throw to him. Some people say that his greatest achievement was surviving the Antarctic, 14 to 17. It might actually be surviving the Royal Geographical Society, 1901 to 2025. But we'll move on to a different section of the collection. I want to look at some of the artifacts that we have in the collection. We have a number of wonderful pieces related to Shackleton's various expeditions. The two most sought after are Shackleton's Burberry helmet from the Discovery expedition. This is from his polar journey with Scott and Wilson. And then the Bible that Queen Alexandra gave to him, or gave to the expedition, the Endurance expedition, later. Here we see, here this is the Bible, this is not the Bible, this is the Burberry helmet, but there's a lovely little inscription on it to a theatre producer, Frank Thornton, who he met aboard SS India. Frank Thornton was on his way to Australia to put on a play called When Knights Were Bold. The inscription reads, "To Frank, I give this helmet, though it is not of any use in his combat when knights were bold. It may be liked, as it was worn when nights were cold, when the most southerly point in this world was reached by man, with kindest wishes from E.H. Shackleton, 1907. A lovely little thing, that. But I just want to go slightly off-piste here. The stories in our collections do a wonderful job about teasing out the stories of specific expeditions, but the collections tell a wider story, not just limited to individual exploits or acts of exploration. But just as you'll find here in the Explorers Club, I'm sure, expedition successes and failures inform the planning and execution of other expeditions. Shackleton's reputation after Nimrod and Endurance was certainly on the up. And we can evidence the beginnings of an expeditionary cross-pollination, in this case, from the world's second pole to the third. We know that the fabric that Shackleton's Burberry helmet was made out of was the Burberry gabardine fabric, which was obviously also worn, oh, it's gone off, sorry, which was also worn on the Endurance expedition. But lending from previous experience, the MEC, or Mount Everest Committee, outfitted the British Mount Everest expedition in 1922, 23, and 24 in high-altitude clothing made with this fabric. To the climbers on those expeditions, these garments were affectionately known as their Shackletons. Indeed, it was these garments that many of the expedition in 1921 were wearing when they surveyed an area of the Himalaya the size of Switzerland, and that expedition and the surveys that they did on that would essentially create the cartographic information which would underwrite the next 50 years of mountaineering on Mount Everest. It was an exceptional feat wearing their Shackletons. Interestingly, once you begin to tease out these threads, you'll find they begin to run, ha ha. The following comes from our Mount Everest archive, applications for membership of the Everest expedition. God only knows when you survived the Endurance expedition why you would want to apply to the Mount Everest expedition. But this is what Thomas Ord Lees did. This is his application to join the 1921 Mount Everest expedition, or demand, depending on which way you read it. He writes, and it's very difficult to read, but he writes, "It is merely a request that you will give consideration to my oft-repeated applications, which I have made consistently for the last 3 years. Everest has been my one ambition since my childhood days. Shackleton would confirm that, as I often spoke to him of it. More than 3 years ago, I got in touch with Kellis, perhaps the finest man technically you could have, but entirely lacking in driving power, if I may be allowed to criticise. I did a good deal of work on the subject in investigating the oxygen project, and I was also very keen on getting one of the newspapers to back us up. Mr. Hinks principally ignored me and implored me not to do anything of the kind. Interestingly, both bottled oxygen and newspaper support were going to be critical to future successes on Everest. So our longest-serving secretary, Arthur Robert Hinks, was well known for his controlling nature and dislike of mavericks, which Steve mentioned earlier. This wouldn't be the first time that someone would fall foul of Hinks. Shackleton did, but also so too did John Knoll, the Everest expedition photographer from the 1922 and 24 expeditions. We also know that John Knoll, the expedition photographer that recorded the 22 and 24 Mount Everest expeditions, drew heavily on Herbert Ponting, but also Frank Hurley and Ernest Shackleton, particularly in relation to his thinking around the final presentation of imagery, but also its use in promotion for the expeditions that he was involved in. But this brings us nicely on to what is without doubt the most remarkable of the materials in the related to Shackleton in our collection, and much safer ground for me. I'm not a Shackleton expert or endurance expert to the extent of others in the room. My speciality is in photography related to exploration, particularly early photography related to exploration. As you'll instantly recognise, these photographs by Frank Hurley. The first is a negative of the Spectre ship, shown in negative, one of the full-plate glass negatives. Well, there's not really much you want to say about it, really, is it? And this is a photograph of Frank Hurley in the rigging. So there are over 200. Okay, so there are over 200 negatives in the collection, a mixture of celluloid negatives and glass plate negatives. So obviously celluloid taken on Frank Hurley's Kodak Vest pocket camera, and glass negatives taken on his large format camera. So the the whole plate glass negatives are of the professional standard sizes of 6.5 by 8.5 inches. But we also have a much smaller number of half plate glass negatives, 4.5 by 5.5 inches, and they are stupendous. We have a remarkable number of glass plate negatives in the collection and prints made from them over time. We talk to visitors regularly at displays and presentations about the remarkable journey that some of these glass plate negatives have made and survived to return or come to the Royal Geographical Society. We talk about the quarter plate glass negatives that have come down the slopes of Mount Everest, for example, in 1921 and 22, and been dried over yak dung at base camp. We talk about the mammoth plate glass negatives that survived the journey with Carlton Watkins to Yosemite and back on mule. Just stupendous in their own right, but nothing really comes close to the journey that these glass plates have survived, being submerged in icy, slushy water, being hauled across the ice, and a stupendously dangerous boat journey. And as has been alluded to before, I've actually lifted them all at once. We have them in several boxes, and just to feel the weight of them when we were preserving them, they are stupendously heavy. I mean, it's colossal. The amount of energy that was expended in bringing these things back to the UK for to disseminate, to articulate what had happened in visual form is quite exceptional. Sorry, I'm going off on one here. It's at an interesting time as well, because collections such as ours are reaching quite a moment in terms of preservation of our photographic holdings. So you find that many of the 35mm slide and negative stocks are from the 50s, 60s, 70s, are trying their best to spontaneously combust. They off-gas, the plastic releases all sorts of chemicals, and they try to eat themselves, which is a problem that we've been facing at the moment. But these glass plates are in incredible condition. The glass is comparatively inert, and it is quite an exciting prospect that, these could be around for another 100 years when stocks from Everest, in the 50s, might disappear in the next 25 years in anything other than digital form. So what can be achieved going forward with the technology that we're coming into now to retell Shackleton's story in a more and dramatic visual way? It's quite a thought. As I've mentioned, the Society held a collection of nearly 1 million pieces of original photography. The Society was something of an early adopter when it came to photography. In fact, the Society debated the utility of photography just 3 months after photography was announced by Fox Talbot in the UK. And we have, what's happened there? Oh, there we go. And we're also lucky enough to be able to tell the Endurance Expedition and the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition from both halves, as we have 2 amazing albums of photography in the collection from the Ross Sea Party and the steam yacht Aurora, taken by engineer Ninnis. As you know, the Aurora, under the command of Aeneas Mackintosh, sailed from Hobart, Tasmania, for the Ross Sea on the 20th of December 1914. Shackleton had ordered the crew to proceed to the Ross Sea, make a base at some convenient point in or near the McMurdo Sound, land stores and equipment, and lay depots on the Great Ice Barrier in the direction of the Beardmore Glacier for use of the party that he expected to bring overland from the Weddell Sea coast. These are, please come to the Royal Geographical Society and please do look at these albums. They are exceptional. They don't rival. You have an open invitation. Email me when you're in London, please. They don't have the artistry of Hurley. They don't reach his heights of professional perfection, but they do tell an incredibly intimate story in desperate fashion, or of their day-to-day struggles and survivals. The photographs in these albums are ordered in a linear narrative, with a linear narrative in mind, so you get an amazing through story of what these men did and faced together. The images relating to the refit of the Aurora are particularly fascinating for me, but I do hope that at some point someone will conduct a study of these albums. None has been done so far, so if you're interested, please do. Anyway, so we're running out of time. I hope that we have begun to successfully rectify this terrible slur of Zaz's, that we don't have much Shackleton stuff at the Society. But what do we do with my colleagues' questioning of the prominence of Sir Ernest Shackleton at the Royal Geographical Society, and where does he sit in our pantheon of great historical figures? It's a crowded membership field at the RGS, as it is here at the Explorers Club, and we have some challenges. Here we see on the far side, this is David Livingstone's fellowship certificate. Usually 2 signatures are enough to get you elected to the society, but he was so popular they had to add an extra sheet of paper to allow everyone to sign his sheet. In the middle we have, this is the scan from the original slide taken by Edmund Hillary of Tenzing Norgay, standing at the summit of Mount Everest in 1953, the first 2 men to stand on the summit of the mountain. That's got to be worth something. Over here we have Charles Darwin's pocket sextant. So this was carried with him on the Beagle and then on the Galapagos. And again, like Livingstone, Charles Darwin wasn't short of a few signatories on his fellowship certificate. So where does he rank? Where does he sit? Well, I can tell you that members of the public don't make pilgrimages to the RGS to see Dr. David Livingstone's certificate or cap. They don't swoon at photographs of Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary, and nor do they go weak at the knees when they see Charles Darwin's sextant, or more importantly, examples of his work. They do, however, beat a path to our door to see Shackleton's helmet. They do silently approach Queen Alexandra's Bible and slyly take out their phone. And they most certainly do not whisper across the table, "He's my hero," for anyone else. The combination of the story of the endurance, Shackleton's clear grasp of inspirational leadership under incredible stress, and the fantastic, dramatic, as you've seen, jaw-dropping scenes captured by the greatest polar photographer of all time, have certainly cemented Shackleton's place as the clear leader in this competitive arena of greats. Clearly, he is quite obviously the boss. Thank you.